Saturn Theory postulates that only a few thousand years ago, or I should say kind of maybe 4, 5, 6, 7-ish, all the way up until about maybe 12 to 15,000-ish years ago, Earth orbited what we now know as Saturn. Yes, I realize that the sudden urge to smash that dislike button with the fury of 1,000 suns just welled up inside of you, and of course, you would also hit that unsubscribe button if you were subscribed to this garbage channel. But give me a second to make my case, and perhaps you might get a completely different perspective on not only cosmology and the origins of kind of where we are right now with respect to our solar system, but also you have the potential to gain a new, fresh perspective on human history. Now, I'm well aware of how insane the theory sounds when you first heard it. I was right there with all of you when I first ran into this theory over a decade ago. The staple of the theory sounds absolutely insane. And when I ran into this theory a while ago, I had the exact same reaction that you are probably having right now. You're probably going, what the hell? What do you mean Earth was orbiting Saturn? What kind of schizo crap is this? How the hell do you get Earth orbiting Saturn? It's not even possible, right? There's no way Earth could have orbited Saturn. I mean, especially only a few thousand years ago, right? The premise sounds absolutely insane. But here's something that I wish somebody had told me back in the day, because this would have saved me a ton of time in my research. I wish somebody had asked me to ask myself this question. Why is it that I am incapable of looking at a proposed theory that is backed up 100% by scientific and historical evidence? Why is it that I have no desire to look at a completely different theory that might answer a lot of the questions that I've been having my entire life? Why is it? Why was I so quick to dismiss the concept of Saturn theory? The answer is simple. The reason why I personally discarded the Saturn theory is because it did not line up with all of the other stuff I had been taught from mainstream cosmology. When I ran into this theory, I always considered myself to be open-minded. I always thought that I was, objective and that I would look at other potential theories and be able to take them seriously, mull them over and then go from there, right? And take whatever from the theory seems legitimate and move on with life. However, the Saturn theory, my very first exposure to it, I didn't even give it a chance because the premise was ridiculous. But the funny thing is that the premise was only ridiculous to me because I had been psychologically conditioned my entire life to believe that something else was the truth. I had been taught my entire life that, the way cosmology works is everything takes millions and billions of years to happen, right? Theory of uniformitarianism. And especially when it came down to cosmological understanding, I was basically under the assumption that, yes, cosmologists might generally not have a perfect picture about what's going on in the universe, and they don't, and a good cosmologist will admit this. But that is not how cosmology is taught in the Western world. The way mainstream academia teaches cosmology nowadays, you would think that they have everything all figured out, more or less, and not only that, but that they have the scientific evidence to support all of the claims that create modern astronomy. You like how I said astronomy instead of cosmology? Because I had said cosmology like 20 times in one sentence? That's right, see, I give you variety on these shows. Modern day cosmology really does go out of its way to make itself look as though it has everything figured out. And by everything, I actually mean everything. Because not only do cosmologists pretend to know how planets are made, how stars are formed, how meteorites are created, blah, 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 all of this stuff, right? They really do put on a fantastic show that would make your average person believe that they have all of this science to support all of their claims. When you start looking into this science, however, it becomes very, very clear very, very quickly that modern day cosmologists are operating on nothing but their imagination. The reality is, modern day cosmology is essentially comprised of like 90% theory and 10% actual real science. That's literally the position that we find ourselves today in the Western world. Seriously, pick a topic. I don't care what topic it is. Go look at star formation, for example, right? And the first thing you're going to run into is that everybody knows that stars are thermonuclear in nature. And most people, unfortunately, in the Western world will simply nod their heads and move on with life. Because the reality is, the vast majority of people on this planet are not going to look into the theory, the thermonuclear theory. They're not going to go look at the equations for the simple reason that most people are not thermonuclear chemists. So I understand that. It's not like that's, I'm not talking crap about anybody. But mainstream cosmology can use that kind of a situation in their advantage. Because if nobody, like generally speaking, is going to go dive in and double check their work, how are you ever going to prove them wrong? The only people who are going to go and look at the thermonuclear theory are people who are already on board with the thermonuclear theory. They're not going to go in there with a fresh perspective and think, oh wow, I can't wait to change the paradigm on how stars are formed and how they're powered and all that crap. No, when they dive in there, they're going to get in there, they're going to look at the equations, and they're going to continue to propagate that kind of theoretical work. Now, the theoretical word there is key, because the reality is, like the vast majority of the thermonuclear theory is just that. It's only theory. We do not have any actual proof that the thermonuclear model is what is driving star formation. We don't have any evidence for that. The only thing that drives that is the theoretical math and physics that was created to create this story, or I should say to propagate and hold up the thermonuclear story. Now, even if you're not a thermonuclear chemist, and that's fine, I'm not either, it doesn't take that much skill to go and look at the theory and realize that the vast majority of it is theoretical. This is a problem. This is a huge red flag. Any time we come up to a theory that is just absolutely drenched in other theories, we have a problem. This is not how we do science. We do not base theory on top of theory on top of theory. That is not how you're supposed to do it. But that is how mainstream science is operating nowadays. To make matters worse, that theory is not taught as a theory even on a base level nowadays to the general populace. No, the theoretical principles are taught as if they are established fact. Everybody knows that the thermonuclear model is the correct model for stars. We're just waiting on a few experiments, guys, don't worry, but we're pretty sure this is real. So go ahead and teach everybody that this is fact. That's what's going on, right? You're not allowed to question the thermonuclear model in mainstream academia. It's not going to happen. Now, I'm using the thermonuclear model as an example, and I'll get to Saturn theory here, because the thermonuclear model is going to be important to throw away when we start diving into this theory. Okay, you know what? Let's just get into the theory now. Okay. I know, you guys are smart. You guys know what's up. But holy crap, does this stuff piss me off. I mean, because, what are we supposed to do with an institution that knowingly trains a general population to believe that theories that are inherently wrong are instead fact? I mean, how much damage do you think that is doing right now to the psychology of modern day Western world? It's incalculable. I mean, right now, you can look around and you can literally watch the degradation of the intellectual capabilities of the modern Western world. And you can do that because stuff like this is happening, because theoretical properties are being taught as factual. You know what else causes a problem with this, by the way? It's funny. So a lot of people out there are going to subconsciously understand that aspects of whatever, thermonuclear model garbage isn't real. You'd be surprised. Even people who aren't really, they don't even care about this stuff. I guarantee you it, even on a subconscious level, when people hear that stuff, they have questions and they have doubt. But you are not allowed to have question and doubt, and because there is a 24/7 hour propaganda campaign that shoves this stuff down your throat every 2 seconds, people are trained to push aside their intuition. People are told that no, it has to be thermonuclear, let's just say, for example, right? Or to make matters even funnier, we know these cosmologists, they believe in things like dark matter and dark energy. We have zero proof for dark matter and dark energy, for example, and not only do we have no proof for it, the only reason why it exists in mainstream cosmology is simply because cosmologists had to figure out a way to explain the observational evidence, because the theory of gravity was not working the way it should to explain what we were seeing. So they had to postulate or theorize. We can just say they pulled garbage out of their butt, and then they said, oh yeah, dark energy and dark matter, it explains everything. And then if you say, well, prove it, they say, well, you can't see it. I can't prove it. Basically what they're saying is, these scientists are the same kind of people who will go up to a religious person and ask the religious person to prove that whatever God they believe in exists. And then the religious person can come back and say, well, I can't show it to you, but you can see the effects of my deity doing whatever, right? Trees exist, humans exist, the planet exists. This is proof of a God. And then, of course, the scientist will scoff at that and walk away, because that's not really the kind of empirical data that they were looking for. Right, so they'll walk away laughing and scoffing. Now, if you pull that same trick on a cosmologist that believes in dark matter or dark energy, you'll get the same answer. That's the ridiculous part of this whole thing. If you ask a cosmologist to show you the evidence of dark energy, and I mean the tangible evidence, the testable evidence, the predictive evidence, right? We want to see the evidence. If you ask them for that, the cosmologist will come back and simply say, well, look at the galaxies, look at the way orbits happen, etc. That's proof of dark energy and dark matter. It was like, what are you talking about? I don't see anything. There's no proof of anything. You have provided me with absolutely nothing, and I swear to God, I'm going to go crazy. Now, before we get into explaining the various aspects of Saturn theory, let me give you a warning. And this is something that mainstream cosmologists will never do for you. But I'm going to do it for you right now because I'm such a nice guy. The warning is this. I'm going to present to you a theory, and it will be backed up by evidence, and I am not going to be able to get too in-depth because of time constraints, but there's great videos and books out there that will support this, and I've done some videos on this crap too, and we'll keep going. But here's the warning. We do not have all of the answers yet. Saturn theory is just that. It's a theory. It's backed up by science and history. Those are two very good sciences to have in your corner if you are going to theorize an explanation for something. Even though we do have a good chunk of evidence, we are still missing much more. Many more? We are still missing a lot more evidence. So it's really important to understand that as I go through this theory, I'm going to give you the basics of it, and I'm going to try to present to you guys several other perspectives on the theory as well. And I believe presenting multiple perspectives is important anyways, because that's what all science should be doing if we're in a theoretical area. The more perspective that we have on a concept, the better the chance we can discover the truth. Like it or not, we really do need each other, and I can't stress that enough. One of the beautiful things about doing real science and what Saturn theory will do for you is that it really will open up an entire world to you, and it will connect you in ways to other people that you did not believe was possible initially. Now, I know that sounds crazy. The reason why I say that is because in the modern world right now, there is one hell of a psychological operation going on that is pushing individualism to a point of self-destruction. And at this point in Western society, this is a scientific fact. You can't actually argue with me anymore on that, because we can now see the negative effects splitting society apart, splitting the sciences apart, because nobody wants to work together and nobody wants to change. One of the other problems that we face with rampant individualism is that once you get into that tunnel of your own, personality, and everything has to be about whatever crazy stuff you make up for yourself, the rest of the world will disappear, and there is a less likely chance that you are going to willingly change should the evidence or the environmental changes require it. So we really do have a serious problem, not just in the sciences. There is a legitimate crisis in science, but we just have a problem that this kind of stuff creates within society itself. And whether you know it or not, or whether you like it or not, it is affecting your current existence. Like, it just is. Anyway, the main point is that there is a lot of room for discovery, and you do not have to be a cosmologist, by the way, to make discoveries with respect to Saturnian theory. One of the amazing things that Saturn theory does, aside from starting to explain all kinds of cosmological stuff that we currently observe in our solar system, it also goes a long way into making and helping us understand what our ancestors are talking about that happened in the past. Because our ancestors talk about all this insane stuff going on in the sky and on the ground here on Earth. Right? Catastrophism. And we have gods constantly fighting in the sky, and gods constantly destroying things and creating things and doing all this really weird stuff, right? So, we have Isis flying around looking for Osiris's body parts. Like, what the hell is that? Like, what kind of mythology even is that, right? And then she's like looking for his dong and she can't find, okay, it's, something, anyway, it's crazy. But what Saturn theory will help you understand, for example, it will give you a new understanding on the Osiris myth. Not only will it give you an understanding, it will give you an understanding based on science. And what's even crazier is that suddenly those stories, which sounds right now like they're absolutely out of their mind and insane, suddenly you can start to look at those stories through a new scientific perspective. And you will start to see that our ancestors went through some unbelievably insane cosmological events. And a lot of the mythologies that exist nowadays, or that have been passed down to us nowadays, are not fictional stories. These are not, some sort of just great epics that our ancestors were writing because they were bored. No, our ancestors were trying to record this stuff because it actually happened to them. And they were trying to tell us. And modern day people mostly now completely ignore this stuff. So if you're just a historian, an ancient historian especially, you can make discoveries relative to Saturn theory as well. All right. Okay, I know, 12 million hours later, let's get into Saturn theory and let's see how crazy this stuff gets. We all know nowadays that Saturn looks like this. It's a gas giant with all kinds of bands and belts circling around on the surface of the planet, or in the atmosphere, I should say. And then, of course, it has its iconic ring system that goes around it. And then it's got some moons and stuff like that. The main point here, though, is we are just going to focus on Saturn. You see, Saturn, in the way that we see it nowadays, it did not look anything like this back during ancient times. So, what that means is that you have to completely delete your current version of Saturn, and instead of imagining Saturn as a gas giant with rings, now let's turn Saturn into a brown dwarf star. What? What are you talking about? What do you mean a brown dwarf star? Yes, imagine Saturn, but no longer with rings. but now glowing a reddish purple, and it's a huge brown dwarf. I know you're thinking brown, shouldn't it be brown? No, brown dwarfs are not called brown. There was a problem with the naming convention for this crap. Anyway, so it's called a brown dwarf, so we're going to call it a brown dwarf. But it did not look like a giant spherical poopy flying around the universe. Okay, that's not the way Saturn would have looked. Saturn would have been a brown dwarf star. Now, if you are still with me, your first question should be, wait, so what you're saying is that Saturn was a brown dwarf star. Okay, fine. But what? So there was a brown dwarf star orbiting where Saturn is now around our sun? No. One of the foundational principles of Saturnian theory is this. Saturn, in its brown dwarf mode, was simply out in the middle of space doing its own thing. It was not orbiting the sun yet. Now, Saturn as a brown dwarf becomes a little more scientifically believable, right? Because if Saturn was a brown dwarf star orbiting where Saturn currently orbits around our sun, we would have had some problems. And in fact, that combination is actually not possible. We'll maybe talk about that later, but I really just want to go over the basics. So I know I'm rambling, but okay. Anyway, Saturn as a brown dwarf star could not have orbited around our current sun. Those two bodies would not be able to coexist. Or at least, they would not be able to coexist for very long. Anyway, so we have Saturn floating out in the middle of nowhere in brown dwarf mode. Before we go further, I'm going to also ask you to completely get rid of the concept of the thermonuclear model when it comes to understanding how stars are formed and how they are powered and the phases that they go through. This is going to be extremely important to be able to do, because if you still hold on to the thermonuclear model, the Saturnian theory won't make any sense. Now, you could probably start saying, and I get it, you're probably saying, well, okay, fine, then that means Saturn theory is wrong because the thermonuclear model is right. Now, remember, at the beginning of this show, or whenever I was ranting, I told you that that just huge chunks of the thermonuclear model are simply fictitious. I don't even want to use the word theory because all the stuff they created, all the theoretical equations that they had to pull out of this thin air to make the thermonuclear model, I can't even speak, to make the thermonuclear model work, they had to create all kinds of theoretical equations to match their theory with the observational data. Now, you can do that in science. There's nothing technically wrong with creating a theory and, of course, trying to prove it correct. But realistically, if you're a good scientist, what you should be doing is you should be trying to prove your theory wrong. Why do I say that? Well, it's simple. If you have a pet theory, that's fine. But if all you do with your theory is just try to find evidence that supports it, and you ignore all of the evidence that is outside of your theory that does not support it, that's not a good theory. And of course, when you present your theory to actual intellectual people, those people are going to call you out on your garbage, and you will be ill-prepared to defend your theory because you were so busy trying to prove that it was correct that you didn't stop to look at all the problems that you actually had to overcome. Now, one of the ways you can kind of overcome those problems is by creating more theories to fit into your bigger theory so that your theory will be correct with respect to observational evidence. And that's what happens. So what has happened in modern day cosmology and science in general is that everybody basically has theories built on top of theories, built on top of other theories. And then, of course, after, over the decades and then the centuries, as these theories start to be forgotten as theories, and everybody just assumes that they're correct, something stupid like the Ice Age, it just becomes ingrained in general academia. And then, of course, it just will then spread out, and it will become part and parcel of, that society you live in. people will take the theory for granted as if it was real. Right? So you can't do that. If you have a pet theory, try to prove it wrong. Okay, yeah. Thermonuclear model equals bad. That's all you have to remember. And in fact, just forget it for this particular walkthrough. Right? That's going to help you out as we go through this. So we need to replace the thermonuclear model with something else. We have to make sure that we understand how a star operates, or how stars in general operate, because this is going to be key into understanding the events that took place. So we need a different theory. Hey, good news, we have a much better theory, and this theory is actually based on real science. In fact, you can even test some of this stuff in your own house. And right now, there's a lot of really good experimentation going on to further the electrical star theory. Now, I'm not going to go too crazy into depth because I want to focus more on, the events and what took place. So if you want more details, go Google it. There's all kinds of amazing papers out there and videos and stuff like that that will help explain the electrical model. But in a nutshell, what's going on is that a star is not a thermonuclear explosion just, exploding every billion times a second. No! A star is instead an externally powered plasma phenomena. A star is just an expression of plasma. That's all it is. And it is being powered externally by what we call a Birkeland current. So what happens is, or what has been discovered, and this was discovered a long time ago, by the way, by mainstream science even. So, mainstream's got it. Anyway, it was discovered a while ago that 99.9% of the universe consists of plasma. You do not need dark matter or dark energy. You don't need any of that stuff. It was already proven a while ago, and it has consistently been substantiated throughout the decades, that the universe is 99.9% plasma. All right, interesting. So already we don't need to worry about weird gravitational mechanics with invisible matter. So we can also now get rid of all that garbage. That's going to be important as well. Because one of the claims that Saturnian theory generally makes, there's various views on this, and we'll cover some of them if I get to the damn theory. But anyway, the reason why this is important is because the general view of Saturn theory is that a lot of stuff obviously has to happen really quickly. If I'm going to make the claim that Earth was orbiting Saturn, let's just say 12,000 years ago, and now we look at our solar system, and that's not the case, right? Obviously, it's a completely different situation. We have to explain it, but it also means that we have to explain how the solar system is now looking the way it does now, as opposed to how it looked 12,000 years ago, because there would have had to have been quick events taking place to organize the planets into the order we have now. Right? This did not take millions and billions of years. The postulate is 12,000 years ago. I'm just going to use that general number. That's not the true number. I don't know what the true number is. It's just not that long ago. Anyway, another discovery that was also made with respect to understanding the general universe and how it works was that Christian Birkeland discovered what would eventually be called Birkeland currents. Birkeland currents are essentially electrical power lines running throughout the universe. Now, I'm not going to go too crazy on the science behind this because I'd like to get through the theory, but just imagine, essentially, stars are being powered by an outside source. They are not being powered internally by, ridiculous atomic explosions. That's not happening. The concept is just ridiculous. So a star gets its energy from an electrical source. So what that means is that yes, a star is a property of electricity, or essentially a better word for it is that a star is a ball of plasma. Now, here's how Birkeland currents work really quick. So this coaxial rotating band of electricity flows throughout the universe, and there's a lot of them. And yeah, we actually do have pictures of them. NASA has photographed these things all over the place, so they exist. We know they exist. We have the visual evidence, we have the all of the scientific evidence that proves it, and you can even run experiments to prove it as well. So that's the good news here. That does not mean we have it all figured out, though. All right, we do not have every little mechanic worked out. there's still room for improvement. All right, so remember that. So if you're one of those geniuses in plasma physics, divert your gaze in this direction, please. Anyway, so what happens is that these Birkeland currents flow through the universe, and sometimes in certain areas, what will happen is that a portion of that current will collapse in on itself. As it collapses in on itself, what you find is a focused point of that electricity. And as that electricity starts to build up in that area, what you will get is a plasma phenomena. That plasma phenomena will be what we call a star. The area of the Birkeland current that is essentially being pinched, we call this a Z-pinch or a Bennett pinch. What's going on is due to electromagnetic properties, a particular spot in a Birkeland current has been forced into itself, and this will generate a ball of plasma. Now, as this energy concentrates and the star grows, there are various outcomes of that star. This is why, right now when we look at mainstream cosmology, we find all kinds of star categories nowadays, right? Brown dwarfs, red dwarfs, quasars. There's all kinds of crazy stuff out there. All of these kinds of stars are just different representations of a Bennett pinch or a Z pinch relative to the environment that it is in. Or I should say, more accurately, relative to the electromagnetic environment that it is in. So just imagine somebody, pinching a tube, and then suddenly all the pressure builds up there and you get a bubble. Think of it kind of like that. It's not a great, okay, that's not really a good example either, but, anyway, it's just electricity being condensed. How's that, all right? So that's what a star is. Now, a brown dwarf star is just one of those representations of a Z-pinch. Now, a brown dwarf star has some very interesting qualities. Now, all stars are going to be completely different, right? Like I said, there's all kinds of categories in stars. There's definitely going to be some stars you don't want to be anywhere near because they're absolutely insane, right? Like a pulsar would be a pretty bad place to live by, more than likely, I would imagine. I mean, I don't know for sure, but that would probably suck. But if you were to live closer to a brown dwarf star, things might not be that bad. Now, it's important to understand that brown dwarf stars are considered cool stars. They're still technically hot relative to what you and I would consider hot, but relative to what's going on out in the cosmos, a brown dwarf star is a low temperature star. So the picture that we are painting up until this point is that Earth is currently orbiting a brown dwarf star. Now, if you were to go and start looking around and doing a little research with respect to how the mainstream looks at a brown dwarf star relative to orbiting bodies, you'll probably find a mixture nowadays of scientists saying something like a brown dwarf star is too cool to technically keep an Earth-like planet going. But what you'll also find is that not only in the alternative scientific community, but even in the mainstream, if you were to live inside of a brown dwarf star, you would actually be in a pretty good position. Yeah, I said it. Earth was not just orbiting a brown dwarf star, Earth was orbiting inside of a brown dwarf star. Now, when I say inside the brown dwarf star, I don't literally mean inside the actual, plasma part of the star. That was not happening. When I say we were orbiting inside a brown dwarf star, what I'm saying is that we were orbiting the star within its plasma shell, within its electromagnetic sheath. What scientists discovered, and this is from both sides, alternative and mainstream, interestingly enough, what was found is that if you have a planet orbiting within the electromagnetic shell of a brown dwarf star, you could actually keep a planet fairly perfectly regulated on all sides of the spherical body. The reason why this happens is because the heat that comes off a brown dwarf, it's not huge or crazy or anything, but if you were close enough to it, you would get some of that heat. But what's really interesting is that since you're within that plasma shell, what happens is that the heat radiating off of the star bounces off of the plasma shell and back on to the planet. So no matter where you are on Earth, you would be all receiving the exact same energy amount over the entire surface. This would obviously change everything. Just imagine. We now have Earth orbiting a relatively cool star, and as we're doing this, basically life on Earth is fantastic. Anybody living on Earth during this particular period of time in history, and like I said, don't forget, this is not that long ago. This is within the memory of humankind. Anybody or anything living on Earth could potentially be living in a golden age style of environment. Let me elaborate. If the Earth has no seasons and it's getting radiated by a perfectly nice, warm energy, that is going to be conducive to all kinds of animal and plant growth. That means there's no such thing as growing seasons anymore. All plants can just grow and grow and grow and grow. There's no reason to stop. Animals would flourish because everything would be so temperate that almost whoever you were, you could survive somewhere. And you would survive well. This place would have been a literal paradise. Now, from an archaeological, geological perspective, we actually have evidence for Earth existing in just this state. One of the more amazing findings that was made in the past several centuries was the fact that we are seeing that at some point in time, recently in Earth's history, Earth was a veritable paradise. We had huge trees everywhere, huge fauna, huge flora. I mean, you name it. Everything was flourishing like crazy. I mean, could you imagine being an herbivore back in the day where there's just endless trees that are just all massive and huge and constantly growing? You would never want for anything. And then, of course, carnivores would never want for anything either because the herbivores would be flourishing like crazy. And of course, if you're an omnivore, you're living the high life because you have choices like crazy. The concept of farming, ridiculous. Hunting, there's no reason to, right? Everything literally was being provided by the planet. Does that sound familiar? It should. It should sound familiar because every single culture on this planet who has a history that goes back far enough has a time where the Earth existed in a golden age. So we have scientific evidence that Earth was in a golden age status. We have the historical evidence from our own ancestors that make this claim as well. If we are going to stay scientifically honest and we just follow the evidence, right now, substantiating the claim that Earth could have orbited within a brown dwarf suddenly becomes a possibility. Because if Earth did indeed orbit inside of a brown dwarf's electromagnetic sphere, then we should expect to find exactly what we do indeed find in the ground. Evidence of a golden age. So right now we're painting a picture of Earth orbiting within the electromagnetic sphere or the plasma sphere of a brown dwarf star. Earth is being radiated on all sides by a nice even temperature. There's no such thing as seasons. And to top it all off, one of the other things that was discovered about brown dwarfs was that brown dwarfs emit water. So if a brown dwarf is emitting water, what's going to happen to the planet that's close to a brown dwarf? That planet is going to receive a nice sprinkle of constant water misting over the entire planet. Are you starting to see the picture? We have essentially created a scientifically valid situation that we could put the Earth into that would create the exact kind of golden age that our ancestors recorded. However, things change, don't they? If we start to read all of these histories, what happened to the golden age? Well, the golden age was wiped out, wasn't it? Every single culture not only has a story of a time where Earth existed in a golden age, but it also records the time to where the golden age came to a catastrophic destructive end. How did that happen? Well, let's keep using science and let's keep walking through the theory. Now, the golden age has to end. That is what all of our ancestors say. And interestingly enough, we also find evidence of this golden age coming to an end, right? Because right now we do not have huge, lush forests over the entire face of this planet. And we certainly still need to use agriculture to gain food. Remember, in the golden age, everybody records that the concept of hunting or agriculture was ridiculous. Like, there's no reason for it. It's because everything was just right there. Another side note to all of the golden ages, it sounds like people, when they existed during this period of time, it sounds like they did not eat meat. I always found that very interesting. Now, I'm not going to get into any kind of diet debates or anything like that, but it makes me wonder if there were other kinds of naturally grown foods that could have sustained humans more than they would nowadays. Something more akin to a banana. For those of you who don't know, a banana generally is I think the only fruit that exists nowadays, I think, that supplies a human with absolutely everything you need to survive. So in theory, if you ever, got stranded on a desert island and you've got those banana trees on there with you, you should be good. Yeah, I know it will suck constantly eating down bananas, but, you'll live, and you'll live fine. Nutritionally anyways. So it's just something to think about. And bananas are interesting too, because science has no clue where they came from. Bananas are interesting because there's no such thing as a banana seed. The only way you can get more banana plants is by transplanting. There's no such thing as planting banana seeds. It's very fascinating. Where the hell did this plant come from that magically sustains life at the way it does and it just proliferates on its own? It's absolutely interesting. Okay, anyway, Golden Age comes to an end. How? Well, it's a destructive end. All of our ancestors are unanimous on this front, and Saturn Theory agrees. So, what is postulated to happen is this. Saturn, in its brown dwarf state, is out floating around in the universe all happy. It has its own Birkeland current traveling with it, probably, driving the motion, actually, or the velocity. Anyway, it's out there floating around happy. Our sun is also floating around happy as well. Now, let me set the stage for the two star systems that we are going to discuss. So right now we have the Saturnian system. That is what I will reference to when I talk about Earth orbiting Saturn. And then we have the solar system, which would be our current sun, okay? These are two separate solar systems. Remember, we have the brown dwarf Saturn happily floating around, smoking crack, chilling, and then we have the sun over here just doing hardcore drugs, playing, it's crazy over there. Anyway, two separate bodies. Now, both of these bodies are stars. How are stars driven? Stars are driven electromagnetically through Birkeland currents. This means that both the sun and Saturn have electromagnetic sheaths, or plasma sheaths, if you want to call it that, and they spread way out into space, right? If you go and you look at a map of the, you can't really, the sun's, anyway, if you go and you look at the size of the electromagnetic fields around a star, it's insane, right? It travels out way beyond the solar system, for example. Like right now, our sun, its magnetosphere goes way out there. Same with Saturn's. So if we have two bodies that are floating out there, even though they are not anywhere physically near each other, their electromagnetic fields are. Because remember, they expand way out in the middle of nowhere. What happens is this. Saturn and the sun are floating along, and then all of a sudden, their electromagnetic fields touch. What happens when two differently charged bodies touch? All hell is going to break loose, because electricity wants to get itself into a neutral state. That's what electricity generally tries to do on its own. And that means that it essentially self-organizes. Now, this is something important to note, Because right now, if you're wondering about gravity, how the hell isn't everything explained by gravity? I mean, what's going on? We haven't even mentioned gravity. Correct. We don't need gravity. Gravity is a trash force. What force is gravity? Gravity is the weak force. Gravity is pathetic. It's literally pathetic. Gravity is nothing. This is actually another concept that you guys are going to have to roll with me on, right? And don't worry, this is all 100% backed up by science. I know right now that mainstream cosmology blames gravity on everything. And if you're wondering why mainstream doesn't really talk about electricity, it's because if they were to acknowledge electricity playing a part in cosmology, that would completely destroy everything that they have currently worked for their entire lives. Basically, their entire life is based on a lie. A lot of them probably do know it, although a lot probably do not either. And people don't want to give up that lie because they've dedicated that much time to it. Also, for some weird reason, the authoritative power structures that exist nowadays, I'll just say, they also, for whatever reason, don't want to promote the electrical standpoint as well. In my opinion, that's probably because it is the truth, and that if more people were aware of the electromagnetic properties of space and electricity in space, it would probably change a lot of stuff, and people would probably start to figure out stuff that the powers that be are not interested in sharing. I guess, I don't, just speculation, but I don't know, man. That's probably it. Anyway, electromagnetism is literally 10 to the 36th power more powerful than gravity. So that should matter. I mean, that should be an incredibly important concept, but mainstream cosmology completely ignores it. All right, anyway. But we know for a fact that all this stuff does indeed exist out there in space. Even NASA themselves have proven it, using their own... Okay, anyway. So if we have a powerful force like electromagnetism, what can we do with that? Well, let's see what happens. So we have two oppositely charged bodies. We have the negatively charged Saturn and the positively charged Sun, and their electromagnetic force fields touch each other at a distance. What happens here? Well, imagine this. Imagine two soap bubbles essentially touching one another. What becomes of those two soap bubbles, assuming it doesn't pop? What happens? Well, those electromagnetic spheres are going to attract to one another, and they're going to create one larger electromagnetic bubble. Now, let's paint in a few more details about our two opposing solar systems. The Saturnian system has Earth orbiting it, but it also has other planetary bodies orbiting it as well. One of the other planetary bodies that has been mostly confirmed is Mars. It gets even more interesting because there's a good chance that Mars and Earth were orbiting relatively close to one another while they were orbiting around Saturn as a brown dwarf. What I mean by that is that it certainly might seem like our ancestors could actually see and make out details on Mars to the scale of something like our moon. So like right now when you look up at the moon, you can see the lava fields, you can see you get a general idea of the major features. It's entirely possible that our ancestors had that exact same kind of view of Mars. Yeah, crazy, I get it, but it gets even crazier. Because apparently, the way the orbits were set up is they were not set up in the way that we think of as orbits right now. And by that I mean, right now we orbit with respect to the sun's equatorial plane, right? So we're all kind of in that plane, generally speaking, and we're all just orbiting it in our own orbits, in our own speeds, at our own time. That apparently was not the case with the planets orbiting Saturn. The planets orbiting Saturn had two potential configurations, and there might be others as well. Remember, we still don't have all of the answers, but for right now, it seems like there are two possible configurations that our ancestors witnessed up in the sky. And that was this. So, Earth, Mars, and potentially other planetary bodies that I may not be able to name right now. they were not orbiting within Saturn's equatorial plane, but instead they were phase locked at the south pole of Saturn. So what this means is that if you are on the north pole of Earth and you are looking up, what you would find is you would see the huge purple red glow ball of plasma, which would be, Saturn in its brown dwarf state. And then you would see at least Mars right above you. And then behind Mars, you would potentially see another planetary body. And then behind that planetary body, you would then see the purple red glowing sphere of Saturn. So the formation that you would essentially see would almost look like a cartoon eyeball, right? You would have the eyeball, you'd have the pupil and the iris all right there, formed by the planetary bodies up in the sky. You would essentially find all these planets lined up as if they were pearls on a string at the south pole of Saturn. The reason why the planets were in this configuration was because the planetary bodies, including the brown dwarf of Saturn, were all locked into a straight line orbit due to the Birkeland current flowing through everything. So essentially, like I said, it's just like strings on a pearl. So just imagine looking up and you would just see a string of planets all the way up until the Saturnian sun. Now, another important thing to remember with respect to this golden age and its eventual destruction is that we find our ancestors talking about a sun that is no longer with us. The sun that our ancestors discussed, the sun that they call the good sun, was the Saturnian brown dwarf. What happens later throughout the historical stories is that we lose the good sun, and that there are 2 or possibly 3 other suns that come down the line in succession after the Golden Age sun is gone. And of course, in everybody's mythologies, this is represented by all of that crazy god drama that everybody now interprets as, fictitious people running around in robes with beards and stuff, slapping each other on the butt, and pushing each other around and, giving birth to weird, there's all kinds of crazy stories. None of these make any sense whatsoever if we try to look at them through a personified interpretation. Because, for example, just look at the story of Osiris, right? Osiris and Isis. Osiris gets chopped up by his brother Seth, and then his body parts are thrown all around the world, and then Isis goes around to collect them all, and then when she does, for some weird reason, suddenly Osiris is now the lord of the underworld. It's weird, right? The stories make no sense if you try to put them into like a fictional context, because it makes our ancestors look like they were constantly smoking something amazing, I guess. I don't know. But it makes them look crazy because the stories are just weird. Ironically, and unfortunately, the way our ancestors decided to describe what they were seeing going on around them in their current environment did not really stand the test of time with respect to how the stories would eventually be understood thousands of years later. By that I mean, our ancestors, they did their best to describe what was going on, and they unfortunately ended up personifying a lot of the stories. So, for example, let's just take the Greek dramas, right? We have all kinds of crazy stuff going on over there with respect to the Greek gods, and a lot of it is just absolutely weird. It makes no sense. If you look at it as a purely fictional, fantastical tale, you can let it slide because it's fiction, right? Zeus is slapping people with thunderbolts, and we have, Kronos is eating his children, and then he spits them out. It's just craziness constantly. Now, your average historian gets around dealing with these stories in any real context because they can just say, well, look, it's that culture's, crazy stories that they make up for entertainment. Yes, maybe some of it is kind of inspired by some sort of a real event. But, ultimately, it sounds insane, and so we are going to throw that into the fiction pile. So once a historian does that, they can move on with life, and they don't have to deal with it. A mythologist will go a little further, but they'll basically stay in the same area, right? When a mythologist looks at these myths, they'll study them, really good, but they're not going to come out and say, yes, this is describing a real event. For example, yes, Kronos ate his children. This actually happened in real life. No mythologist is going to come out and say that because the stories are still insane. What the hell do you mean Kronos is eating his children and he's a god and it's all craziness? So even your mythology person is going to still walk away from the story believing it's a fictional tale. Fictional? Is that fictitious? It's a fictitious tale. Now, the average mythologist might take it a little further and try to find real-life analogies that could have inspired some of the tales or some aspects of the story, but ultimately, they are going to come to essentially the same conclusions as your average historian. Yes, these tales are mostly fiction. Yeah, there might be a kernel of truth in there here and there. And then maybe they'll even try to find what maybe some sort of a king or something is what inspired some of these crazier tales. They'll try to relate it to a real life figure that they are aware of within that particular civilization. But they're not going to say something to the effect of, yes, Kronos actually ate his children. There was a king named Kronos and he ate his children and then he spat them all out. Right? That's not something that would have happened in real life. So, maybe you could say, well, maybe there was a king named Kronos and yeah, maybe he did have his children killed. And yes, maybe he consumed them. But then what about the spitting them out part, right? Well, you could, that's where things get weird, and you could say something to the effect of, well, maybe this means that he's absolved the children of their sins, or maybe he threw them up after he was done eating them, or, something like that, right? They will try to find a real-world analogy to compare the mythology to. And, they'll give it a shot, but ultimately, it's still insane. However, if we incorporate and look at something like Saturn Theory, suddenly all of these stories will start to have a real life, real world possibility to have actually existed. And that's the point of Saturn Theory. Okay, so anyway, what were we talking about? We were talking about the configuration of the two systems that are about to collide. Okay, so we have the Saturnian system, the solar system, the sun system. In the Saturnian system, like I already said, we have Earth and we have Mars for sure in a polar orbit locked at the South Pole. Right, so we're all hanging out down at the South Pole of the brown dwarf of Saturn. Now, there's more than likely other planetary bodies involved with this orbit as well. But I cannot guarantee you all of the planets that were there during this configuration for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that our ancestors would have only have been able to have viewed certain parts of the sky. And it seems like everybody, for some weird reason, was congregated at the North Pole of Earth. Now, before you start, thinking about the North Pole nowadays, how it's just water and ice, essentially, the North Pole of today was not the North Pole during the Saturnian configuration. This is going to be important to remember. In fact, the Earth would look almost nothing like it looks now, back only, 6, 10, 12,000 years ago. Because a lot of the geological or geographical features that we find nowadays on Earth, those were all created during the chaos of the events of what happens during this Saturnian configuration. So if you're imagining Earth right now, you have to imagine it essentially completely different. Earth would not have had, for example, all of the oceans that we see now. There would have been water for sure. Like I said, Saturn would have been misting down water the entire time during the Saturnian configuration. So there would have been freshwater lakes hanging around and possibly, maybe, potentially some saltwater areas. But I can't prove that one way or another. One of the problems with Saturn theory is that, as we've talked about on this channel, all the various cataclysms that Earth has been affected by, all of those cataclysms have done a great deal of damage with respect to destroying evidence of what Earth would have been like during the Saturnian configuration. So I can only provide you guys with the basics. I mean, that's only what this show was supposed to do anyways. And now we're at an hour, and I have poorly explained all of this. So I guess we're going to have to split this into multiple parts. Fine, that's what we're going to do, but I'll do it in well, whatever. I'll just probably make this a schizobabble since I did a pretty poor job describing everything going on. Anyway, I'm going to continue though, because why not? It's good practice for the real version of this that I will do like a couple of years from now when I do not suck quite as bad. Okay, anyway. So the configuration of the Saturnian system would have been Earth, Mars, and several other planetary bodies. For example, Titan could have been one of these bodies that was orbiting with us that our ancestors either possibly recorded and we are just not interpreting their stories correctly, or our ancestors simply couldn't see the other planetary bodies that would have been orbiting at the south pole of Saturn along this coaxial string. That is basically the Saturnian configuration. A brown dwarf floating around all happy with its little planets orbiting at the South Pole within its plasma sheath, or if you want, its electromagnetic field. Now, we have the other solar system that the Saturnian system is heading straight for. The central body of this solar system would be our current sun. Now, our current sun is considered a G-type yellow dwarf, and it is also being powered by a Birkeland current, just like the Saturnian brown dwarf. Same situation. The sun finds itself in this configuration simply because of its current electrical environment. Right? And it's also entirely possible that the sun may not have been a yellow dwarf. It could have been potentially a different kind of star, and then when it begins to interact with Saturn, it may have actually changed the kind of star that the sun was. That's pure speculation. I don't have proof either way. And there may actually be proof out there that shows that no, the sun did not change due to this collision. But I don't know. It's just something to think about. Anyway, so the sun's solar system consists of the sun. Yeah. And it would have also had a sister star, which would have been Jupiter. Now, Jupiter and the sun would have essentially made a binary star pair. Binary stars are quite common out there in the universe. In fact, it's more weird to have a star that does not have a binary partner. So in this situation, we find that our sun was orbiting around or with Jupiter. Now, Jupiter did not look like it looks like now. Okay, same exact deal with Saturn. Jupiter would have been some kind of star. I am not going to make any kind of theories on what kind of star Jupiter would have been. I think there are way smarter people out there that have probably figured that out. I would just go look that stuff up. Go and search something to the effect of Jupiter, brown dwarf, Saturn theory, something like that. I'm sure you'll find articles that might actually have scientific evidence that proves what kind of a star Jupiter was. Regardless, just for our current configuration and for our current basic outline, imagine the sun and another star essentially orbiting one another in a binary pair. And that's basically the solar system of the sun that is happily floating out there on its own. Now, I don't know for sure what other planetary bodies may have existed within the sun's solar system before the collision happens. But it's probably a safe bet to say that yes, there were some sort of planetary bodies orbiting within that solar system. We might be able to look at the current tilts of the planets that we know nowadays. Those current tilts of the the current tilts of the axes of multiple planets might be a key to prove what planets were with what solar system before the collision. But I don't know for sure. I can't prove any of that one way or another. And one of the main reasons why I can't do that is A, we did not have anybody witnessing any of the planetary bodies in the Jupiter-Sun solar system because our ancestors were way far away from that. And also, one other thing I suppose I should have said about a brown dwarf situation is that if Earth is orbiting within the brown dwarf's plasma sheath, one of the effects of being inside of a plasma sheath is that the sky would appear to be opaque. Essentially, people on Earth would not know about stars. They would not know about any kind of existence outside of that plasma sheath because the plasma sheath would be an opaque shield. Literally no light could have gotten through. Also, no radio frequencies could get through either. And that goes both ways. So if a human was trying to communicate with somebody outside of that plasma sheath, modern day understanding of frequencies and how we could modern day understanding of electromagnetism essentially prohibits any kind of a signal getting out or in through that plasma bubble. So what that means is that anybody on Earth, they would have had no clue about stars, and they certainly would not have been able to see any of the planets orbiting the Sun-Jupiter binary system at this point in time. So I can't claim to know what planets were orbiting in that Sun-Jupiter binary system, but I'm willing to bet that they did exist, right? And those planets would eventually become problems for the collision that we are going to eventually describe on another show, because this has gone on too long and I'm all scrambled, and I've probably told this in the worst way possible, but screw it, let's keep going a little longer. All right, so those are our two solar systems. Now, I know I've already kind of said it, but it's something that I believe needs to be understood. This theory is just that. It is a theory. We do not have all of the pieces yet. One of the reasons why I made this channel at all was to disseminate information like this to potential other researchers who actually have a brain, unlike me, and can potentially figure some of this stuff out. That's the strength of this theory. This theory is based on history and science, and there is room for all of us to make discoveries. So that don't just, walk away from this thinking that there is nothing you can do with this information. There is a ton you can do with this information. Literally go apply just everything I've talked about so far here to ancient creation mythologies, and you will find that a lot of those mythologies suddenly start to line up with what I'm talking about here. Now, I know I've done a crap job explaining a lot of this, and we have more to go, and we have a lot of details to cover, even though this was supposed to be a basic situation, or a basic explanation. All right, okay, anyway, so two systems flying around in space. Both systems are electromagnetic bodies, or two electromagnetic systems. These systems are happy floating, but as they move, they slowly start to approach one another. Now, this attraction is guided by electromagnetism. If we have a negatively charged Saturn, for example, or a negatively charged Saturnian system, and it starts to approach a positively charged Sun position, what is going to happen when they see each other electromagnetically? What is going to happen when their two electromagnetic fields touch? What happens when two magnets of opposite polarity get close to one another? That's right, they start to attract. Now, this is something that's important to understand before I shut down this show and go do something better with my life. But one of the things that a lot of people are going to have problems with respect to Saturn theory is how do you deal with gravity and uniformitarianism? These two concepts that plague mainstream science and history are probably going to be the largest hurdles for your average person to overcome. So let me set the stage in a scientific way that will hopefully ease your mind. Like I just showed you, or I used the example of two opposite polarity magnets snapping together, that action is important. And this is an experiment you can do right now if you don't believe me. If you bring two polar opposite magnets together, what happens? They snap together. They even make that snap sound. Why does that snap sound even happen? Well, the reason is simple. The reason why you hear a snap sound between two magnets is because of how quickly those two magnets will attract one another and slam into each other. This is crucial to understand because right now uniformitarianism and gravity properties make everything take millions and billions of years. So I'm talking about these two solar systems potentially colliding with one another. This is not impossible according to mainstream, but mainstream only has gravitational forces to work with. Because the mainstream will only incorporate gravitational forces, that means that everything necessarily has to take a long time. Why is that? Because gravity is a weak force. That's it. Because gravity is so pathetic and so weak, it takes millions and billions of years for formations to happen relative to gravitational theory. This is why cosmologists will always tell you that, oh yeah, it took like 10 billion years to form that galaxy, or 6 billion years to form that planet, or whatever, right? Because gravity sucks. It's not strong. It's pathetic. Now compare gravity to the electromagnetic force, right? I already told you, is what, 10 to the 36th power more powerful than gravity? I mean, that's insane. The Saturnian system and the solar system, they would act just like those magnets, because that is literally what they are. They are two polar, oppositely charged bodies. That means they are going to attract. Now, here's my next scientific question. Using the magnet example, what did we observe with those magnets? Well, we observed that those magnets immediately, almost instantaneously, attracted one another. Those magnets did not take millions of years, billions of years, a week, hours, or whatever to get close to one another. No, the very second those two magnetic fields of those two magnets touched one another from a distance, they immediately snapped together. That is exactly what is going to happen to the Saturnian system and the solar system. You see, we do not need any kind of weird, theoretical, fictitious garbage to explain what our ancestors saw. We can use science, and it's science that you right now can go test and prove in your house, to explain what all of those histories are talking about. Now, we're going to call it here because we're already going way over time and I have other things to do anyway. Just like you should have other things to do, like self-improvement or going to watch the bum fights tonight. I'll be there. Or, if you are a person of class, you might be going to hunt mainstream geologists for sport. And God be with you if you do that. May your hunts bring in many geological scalps, and hopefully that those geologists will understand and fear the truth, because we are now going after them, and we will be slaughtering them en masse. On the next show, we will cover what happens when two oppositely charged solar systems collide with one another.